Okay, I'm Jack Hammond. I'm a teacher here in the sociology department and at Hunter College. And unexpectedly, I am in charge of mediating between the forces of order and the forces of the people who are here in this room. I hope we've succeeded, but in any case, I'm not going to speak very long because unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, I have not been in Brazil for about 2 years. And obviously, the thing that we have most interest in today is much more recent than 2 years ago. Um, I'm going to speak, however, from the standpoint of somebody who has been studying Occupy Wall Street as well as studying social movements in Brazil. And I want to put the current movement in Brazil in an international context. I do have to say, as I say, I haven't been there. Everything I know about the events of the last month or two in Brazil comes from the media, and learning about Brazil from the media, as Jim has just told us, creates a certain amount of problem. But I hope that what I have to say will be interesting. Let me first of all say that it's not a surprise. Everybody knows that there has been a massive international uprising of popular protest against governments starting I put it back to Iran in 2009, the unsuccessful movement against electoral fraud. But then Tunisia at the end of 2010, which succeeded in overturning a government. 2011, the protests moved on to Tahrir Square in Egypt, which also indirectly overturned the government, well, directly overturned the government, indirectly produced a whole set of subsequent events that don't need to go into today. In other places, Bahrain, Syria, where it led to a civil war, which is getting increasingly serious and costly over time. Spain, where Acampada Sol started in Madrid and spread to most of the major cities in Spain. Greece, student movement in Chile is part of the same thing. Here in the United States, we had the occupation of the state capital of Wisconsin in Madison, protesting the effort to deprive public employees of their collective bargaining rights. In New York, before Occupy Wall Street, there was something called Bloombergville, which was an encampment at City Hall protesting budget cuts. And many of the people who put together Bloombergville were leaders at the beginning of what was originally called the New York City General Assembly, subsequently became Occupy Wall Street as well. All of these movements have different causes. Very sort of schematically, we can say that the causes in the Arab world essentially were protests against long-standing, what seemed to be very solidly in power authoritarian governments. Some of them turned out not to be so solidly in power, and some of them are still in power. In Europe, the protest was mainly against the austerity brought about by the, let us say, the neoliberal program imposed by the European Union on the countries of the Eurozone that were in economic crisis in large part because of the policies of the European Union, but where the people were meant to pay the cost in terms of cutbacks in their pensions, cutbacks in their public budgets for schooling and other public services. In the United States, certainly in New York and in the flourishing of protest that spread out from New York and in the Occupy Wall Street movement, the protest was mainly against economic inequality and against the power of financial institutions in politics. I don't have the statistics in my memory, but it's very easy to discover the extent to which the rich have gotten richer. The poor and the middle class have stagnated in the last 30 to 40 years, as a result of changes in the economy, globalization, the decline of manufacturing, the decline of jobs in which relatively uneducated, unskilled person could earn a decent living and be, functionally speaking, a member of the middle class, own a home, have the consumer goods that the average American has, and send kids to college. This became increasingly difficult, despite the fact that during that same period of time, it has become normative for women as well as men to earn incomes, so that most families have two incomes instead of just one. And even with this diversification of the sources of income, the actual standard of living has not risen as much as it has, but as much as the actual standard of living has not risen as much as you would think that a doubling of income would permit. But even more than the objective economic factors that are not imposed by particular policies, we have a protest against the government policies that have accentuated inequality, starting with the George W. Bush tax cuts, the deregulation of the financial system. I'm going to have to stop. I didn't really mean to go on quite so long about the United States. I want to get to Brazil. But what many policy changes within the U.S. government, promoted by both Republicans and Democrats, have accentuated the economic forces that have increased economic inequality in the United States. And this has been the principal issue of the Occupy protests. And yet here, as has been the case in Europe, as has been the case in the Arab world, as has been the case in Brazil, the protests have accumulated a whole range of issues and a whole range of political supporters. So it's very hard to characterize them in any single clear way. Now, what seems to be the case in Brazil, and again, I'm observing only from outside, and all I know is what I read on the internet, I would differ a little bit in emphasis from both Alvaro and Jim by saying that it seems to be very important there that the bulk of the forces behind the major demonstrations of the last month have been the unorganized middle class. The unorganized middle class that, like the American middle class that's suffering some of these changes, finds it very difficult, especially young people coming out of their studies, finds it very difficult to find employment that's commensurate with both the professional knowledge that they've acquired and with the cost of acquiring that knowledge. There are not the jobs available for people with recent university degrees in professional fields. And there is also, again, from my reading, I would emphasize this a little more than Jim did, the sense of resentment against the freeloaders of the working class. I use the term in entre aspas, the members of the working class who are living off of handouts that the PT administration of the last 10 years has started to provide for them. What does it, to the extent that this is true, what does it mean politically? These are unorganized people. These are not part of any right-wing or center-right political formation. They're not part of the PT. They're not part of the far left, the parties to the left of the PT. And nevertheless, I think in part inspired by what has been seen around the world, people have come to think that going out and demonstrating is a positive and efficacious thing. It started, as we know, with a protest against the bus fares, but when most of the increases in the bus fares were rescinded by the municipal governments that had imposed them, and the only thing that's visible as an organizational core of these demonstrations, the Movimiento Passe Livre, said, okay, we won, go home. People didn't go home, which meant that the demonstrations continued without a clear organizational base. And I think that's very important in terms of predicting what may become of this. Like Occupy Wall Street, which I have personally gotten very committed to and I think very highly of, but nevertheless I think we have to recognize that it has exhausted its organizational possibilities. And I suspect that the same thing will happen in Brazil. I suspect that the absence of any clear organization and the absence of any clear ideological coherence, the fact that every conceivable issue, political reform, anti-corruption, protesting the stadium constructions, bus fare, the inferior medical services, all of these things are part of the protest, but they don't add up to a coherent platform from which an alternative political organization might be formed. In fact, they are to some degree contradictory with each other, having elements of right-wing and left-wing ideology. And even if they were more conceptually coherent, that would not automatically translate into political organization. So my suspicion is that in 2014, whoever is the candidate of the PT, whether it's Dilma or Lula, I can't conceive that it'd be anybody other than those two, but whoever is the candidate of the PSDB or whatever the most ascendant right-wing forces at the time, that the overall spectrum is going to look pretty much the same. That doesn't lead me to make any prediction as to who will win, because I think there is a fluctuating voter population that could go in any of several different directions. But I don't think we are looking at the possibility of a major reorganization of the party system that will have important electoral effects in the next year. And whether in the long run, I mean, I guess if you looked at the metalworker strikes in 1978, you would not have necessarily been able to predict that these were going to produce a PT. It may be that there's some underlying force there that will force some kind of reorganization of Brazilian politics over the long run, but I think that the sunk cost, the sunk forces in the existing parties are for the present strong enough that they're not very likely to come up with any significant alteration. I'll stop there. So you're going to take charge?
Sure. I want to open the floor for comments and discussions. I originally was going to do like 5 and then panel 5, like that type of interaction. Does everybody feel okay with that?
Say something.
Absolutely.
This is not a